What's interesting to me is that, in a sense, science fiction itself has become quaint. And I wonder whether science fiction even exists anymore. Because when we start discussing things like, the banality of reality, it occurs to me that there was a point a few decades ago, I don't know exactly where would point the finger, but there was a point at which, for the first time in history, if a human being wanted to, they could probably destroy the entire human race. And there was a point, probably very recently, or in the very near future, where we could all destroy the human race even though we didn't want to. And even though we all want to preserve and try and do the right thing so that we continue, just through our actions of living, through our actions of the way that our systems are structured, we could just grow too large too quickly for this planet and actually destroy the human race. And this is a really interesting point at which to be, because the thing that sort of appeals to me is this idea that actually there might be a chance to harness the power of all those small actions, not so that they sort of coalesce into sort of harmful and unsustainable activities, but actually they could coalesce to sort of achieve some kind of sustainability. And that's really why I'm interested in this whole sort of idea of the structures of participation. I'm actually here in sort of two guises, as Honor said. On the one hand, representing my sort of design practice, and also representing the Urban Projects Division at COSM. So I was trained as an architect, and I still continue to think about operating within the field of architecture. But my work has often fallen into the camp of art because I've, in some senses, felt a little bit more comfortable there. In the architecture world, and this was especially true in the early 90s when I was studying architecture, if you wanted to push a sort of advanced agenda, you often found that you would be writing texts or exhibiting in a gallery. And I found it very odd that architects could be content with the idea of making proposals but never building. And it occurred to me that in the art world, there's almost no artist I can think of that would be content with writing a grant proposal and then not finding it successful. And so, this appealed to me, this idea that the practice of art is actually the practice of reality, in a sense. I was also drawn to this idea that the art world can be quite comfortably non-professional and represent the everyman in interactions with a society. A scientist has a bit more difficulty doing that, but the artist can kind of tread on the fact that people kind of don't trust artists, right? They don't necessarily invest a whole lot of faith in what they're doing, which gives them much more opportunity to be surprised and challenged by it, in a sense. And finally, I was interested in this idea that in the sort of practice of art, you might actually be able to operate at scale. So essentially, the kind of projects that I'm about to talk about, what I'm trying to do is imagine a possible future, but through actually building it rather than just talking about it or proposing it. So all these projects are somehow, they're speculative in the sense that I understand that government is not going to flick a switch right now and say, okay, now we're going to do it. But they're very real in the sense that they are possible right now, and I just want to make them probable. The first project I'm going to talk about is a little bit old. It's called Open Burble. And it was actually an offshoot of the project that Honor mentioned called Sky Year. And with the Open Burble, what I was trying to do is develop a system through which members of the public could assemble something almost like a kit of parts in a public space and then build it up themselves, float it, and control it so that they're actually creating something which, on an urban scale, is the height of basically 15-story buildings. So it's just normal members of the public who assembled this. All the colors that are shooting through it are created through the way that they're controlling this thing, dragging it around the park, shaking it. This was in Holland Park a few years ago. The idea here is that even a sort of normal non-designer person has actually been part of the process of designing something that transforms the urban skyline, even if only for 1 minute. In a sense, it was almost like the the idea of Jack and the Beanstalk, planting something in your backyard, which was able to operate at a much larger scale. Now, in a sense, you could say that this was just sort of pattern making. Each of these sort of units here is a different sort of part of a molecule that groups of people have built. But when they were actually assembling this thing, they were developing their own vocabulary for critiquing it. And what was most interesting to me was to hear the kind of conversations about what was what was right. This is the best way to assemble this. This is how this bit should go. No, it should be symmetrical. No, it shouldn't be symmetrical. And then actually having to negotiate with each other to assemble together the molecules that they'd created and go through that process, which perhaps if you're a designer in a professional sense, you might go through every day, where you actually do have to negotiate and critique each other, but at some point come to a compromise. So that was the interesting thing to me, to see people actually go through that process. And then even in a blog post afterwards by one of the people who took part, who actually said, "That's my baby up there." And this was the sort of most wonderful thing, not to even mention the art project or anything like that, or even the event at which it was at, but just to say, here's a photo of something I made. Now, the things that I took away from this, in terms of these sort of structures of participation, because that's really what I'm interested in here, is how to actually build participative structures, was one, the idea of constraints, that sometimes the more you constrain something, the easier it is to encourage some kind of participation and then creativity based on that participation. When you have a totally wide open field, it's often really difficult to get people to participate because they're scratching their heads and saying, well, it could be anything, so it's probably going to end up as nothing. So the second thing was this idea of the granularity of participation. And this is the idea that there are many different levels at which people may or may not want to be part of something that's going on. There are people who want to be involved in the tiniest details. There are people who wanted to assemble the burble. They wanted to actually discuss how it would be configured, how it would snap into the handlebar that was along the bottom. But then there are people who just wanted to control this thing. The handlebar had sensors in it that responded to movement, basically like a Nintendo Wii controller. And then there are people who just wanted to sit back and watch it, almost like fireworks. And so by sort of very intentionally building in multiple levels at which people might participate in something, I think you help to drive more participation, especially when you figure out ways to drive ever increasingly fine detail participation, if you see what I mean. Primal Source came a few years later. And for me, this project was about trying to find a way. Actually, I knew there were going to be 50,000 people there on the night. And so every single one of these creatures that's flying out of the ground is generated by one person's voice. And these creatures sort of fly around in response to the frequency, the sibilance, the amplitudes, all these kinds of things. And the important thing for me here was that people could recognize immediately what it was that they were doing, and that they could then start to teach each other how making noise would affect this system. So the point of this was really to, if you like, find ways that people could use something very intimate, which is basically their voices, and taking something from inside of them, projecting it out into the physical space. But very crucially, I wanted to create an experience that they kind of didn't believe the next day they'd been part of when they saw the images. So what was kind of interesting to me was to see again, looking at, I'm very interested in the way that stuff is described by people after the event, whether they were there or whether they were not there. And so, of course, a lot of the conversations on blogs after this were that it was Photoshopped, that it would never actually happen. And then there was one really wonderful blog comment by somebody who said, "Why is everybody screaming? Don't they know that art is meant to be experienced in quiet contemplation?" So the thing that I took away from Primal Source was this idea of, in a participative system, wanting to see yourself in there somewhere, to see a reflection that your bit counted, that it actually did something. And so the gratifying thing to see in Primal Source is when people pointed at something and nudged each other and said, that was mine over there. There's mine over there. Hey, that's yours over there. And so it's this idea of sort of projecting yourself. The second was immediacy. That was something I'd got wrong with Burble. I'd got it really wrong because it really wasn't a kind of immediate project. And the strange thing in Burble, these people are controlling this 15-story structure. It takes about 200 people to do it. The thing, and it seems really obvious now, but the thing I hadn't thought of was that the 200 people who are controlling this massive structure couldn't see it because it was above them. So the people who actually enjoyed the effects were the ones who were sitting a couple of 100 meters back. So in Primal Source, I was trying to emphasize the immediacy, the stuff happening right now. And so a lot of my effort to get this project to work were simply in getting the visual response timed to the audio output as narrow as possible, so that as soon as somebody did something, as soon as they changed their voice, that effect would be reflected in a matter of less than milliseconds, because that was the thing that would trigger people's eyes to find what they'd just done. Flightpath Toronto was a project that I did with Natalie Jeremijenko last year. And with this project, what we were trying to do was take the city square, which is Nathan Phillips Square, and try and imagine what a new form of urban mobility might be like. Now, our cities are filled with birds who experience our cities in very different ways to us. They actually experience it in 3 dimensions. We humans, we merely experience it in 2D, right? We walk down the street, we go up in a lift, we walk along a floor, and we never actually experience this kind of 3-dimensional volume of the city, which actually is the thing that makes the city most interesting. This is coupled with the fact that our mobility systems, that's cars and even buses, even the environmentally friendly buses that are running off of natural gas or electricity, are in some way harming the urban environment somewhere, even if it's through some causal effect that we don't see. And so we wanted to propose a new way of moving around the city and actually building it, even if only for one night, so that people could reimagine a way to experience their city, to travel through their city, to get to work, et cetera, et cetera. And so we proposed this idea of basically flying through the streets using zip lines. Because zip lines are this amazing technology that are gravity-based. And if you know what I mean by a zip line, it's the thing that you sort of jump on a rope and it's angled downwards and you just go flying down. And the wonderful thing about this is, of course, it doesn't actually use any fuel at all. It takes gravity to propel people. And so we built this sort of network of lines across the city square. To be frank, there are actually motors on the end of these, which the city required for safety. But in principle, the whole thing is actuated through gravity. And people learned how to fly. They learned about flight, about the different wing patterns. They learned how to sort of bank and turn and things like that. There was a sort of laser system that's voice actuated by people on the ground. You can imagine a sort of control tower that gets faster and faster the louder people are. And the idea here is to actually sort of make this into a sort of monumental event as people are taking off and soaring into the urban sky. There were sort of people of all ages, even a grandmother. And they went from sort of 150 to 400 feet just as a trial. You actually had an autopilot license on your arm, which you got to certify that you'd flown. I'll show a little bit of video now. So this is where you're graduating from having just learned about flying. You actually stand in front of some fans. You climb up one of the towers. It's strapped into the wings. This should be a lot smoother next time we do it. The interesting thing about this kind of initiative is that it's very difficult to test before you actually do it. So you try and test all the different parts of the system, but until you actually get, say, 1,000 people trying to strap on wings, you don't necessarily know how many different people are going to try in many different ways. So what was interesting to me was, again, it's these kind of conversations about flight that took place as I walked around, like listening to people, and actually hearing kids saying, "Can we zip line to school? Wouldn't that be better than going by bus? Wouldn't that be fun?" And this is part of what we're trying to achieve, is this idea of, at the moment, we think of flight as incredibly environmentally damaging, right? We think of planes and we think of all of the environmental impact, actually, of even the catering in planes outweighs the environmental impact of the engines. But this is a way to actually imagine flight as something that's fun. Now, what I took away from this project was this idea that you actually need evidence to convince people to participate. And so the act of creating a spectacle, which people could step back from, they don't have to participate, but when they start to see other people doing stuff, that's when they decide to go into the queue. So it's almost like the spectacle becomes the advertisement for the participation that people then become part of in order to create the spectacle. And the second was this kind of role of imagination. And I'm not sure we necessarily got it exactly right in this project, but trying to tie what you're doing at a particular moment in a particular place, namely Nathan Phillips Square, where a lot of this sort of political activity takes place, with future memory, which is what's going to happen when you walk through this space tomorrow and everything's gone, and you might not even know that it occurred. That link between the imagination and what actually happened becomes very important when trying to sort of propel this participation. I would hope that that kind of project would then spur the citizens to say, hey, why can't we fly to work? Why can't we take a zip line to school? Why can't we do away with the cars down these streets? So finally, just to go through very briefly Patch Bay, which is now called COSM, and a couple of projects that I've built on top of it. So Patch Bay is basically it's like a data broker for sensors and devices. It's a system that I launched a few years ago, basically to make it easy for designers and architects and artists to build systems that communicated with each other remotely. So whether it's temperature sensors or light sensors or what have you, it effectively acted like a kind of Twitter for all these devices to talk to each other in real time. It was acquired by LogMeIn, a US company, last year, and we relaunched as COSM this year. And there's now a sort of worldwide community of I think about 60,000 people doing all sorts of things, citizen-led networks for tracking air quality, radiation. There's products that are built on the system, and all this is happening in real time. Now, the reason I launched it was actually to explore what might happen when you have things that connect to each other in a kind of many-to-many way. A lot of the people who are building things using the system are building one-to-one systems, right? They're building, I don't know, an iPhone app where I can monitor my energy use at home, or I'm building something where I can open up my garage door, which is a one-to-one relationship that I'm not terribly interested in. So with Natural Fuse, power available to this. This was built on Patch Bay, and the idea is that this is a plant with a power socket, and the amount of power that's available at the socket is limited by the capacity of the plant to offset its carbon footprint. Now, even a low wattage LED lamp needs 5 plants to offset its carbon footprint. And so you would not actually even be able to switch on your lamp if it weren't for the fact that chances are that there are 5 other plants out there now that are not currently being used. And so these are all wired using, connected to each other via the internet. And they can communicate in real time. So when you want to switch on your lamp, it wakes up, checks to see whether there's 5 others out there that are not currently being used. And as long as there are, then your lamp will actually go on. If there is not enough carbon capturing capacity out there, then your lamp will go off after a certain amount of time. Now, the dial that's selfish or selfless is that if you're selfless and you choose that, then say if there's not enough carbon capturing capacity, it'll switch off after 20 seconds or what have you. So you'll never damage the carbon footprint of the community, and as a whole, you'll retain sort of carbon neutrality. But sometimes you have to switch on the light because maybe you've heard somebody come in the flat or you've heard somebody come in the door, and then you might want to be selfish. And so when you do that, you get as much power as you need. If you end up harming the carbon footprint of the community, in other words, it goes in the red, then it sends out a kill signal to kill somebody else's plant. And it does this through a vinegar injection. And the idea here is that you know what you're doing, and you just weigh up the consequences. And sometimes you have to do that. But when you do, you're very concretely taking away from the community's resources. Which brings me to the final project, which is called Addicted Toasters. This was actually created by Simone in my office. And these are toasters that know how much the other toasters in the network are being used. And they get very jealous if there are other toasters that are used more than them. The speculation here is that perhaps products should be the finite resource. And perhaps we shouldn't own products. Maybe we need to deserve those products in the sense that the toaster, if it's not being used enough, then it'll start tweeting and say, look, I'm up for grabs. Nobody's paying any attention to me. Nobody's using me. I'm basically a wasted resource. And you can sign up on the website to pitch that you will give it a good home. And at a certain point, it'll then basically call up, well, it'll sort of dial into to DHL and get itself sent over to the new owner. Now, the idea here is that why should we have ownership of these physical devices? What is this idea of actually owning parts of the material that we've extracted from the earth is a bit of an antiquated one. And instead, this might be a model in which we all have to, where our resources go to those who actually make the best use of them. So just to wrap up, so the two things that came out to me here were, one, this idea of the dilemma, and this is almost always present in participative systems. It's the prisoner's dilemma, which is that the first person to participate is always penalized the most. And this is particularly clear, of course, in conversations around climate change. Whichever country or entity makes the first investment probably has to pay the greatest cost. And so you've got to structure things in such a way that the dilemmas actually result in increased usage. So for example, in the natural fuse, you might only get the unit because you like the fact that it'll water the plant and it'll take care of it even when you're not there. But the added benefit of it is that you add to the community's carbon sink. And then the other thing that came out of this was this idea of the incentives, how to build not the incentive of the end goal, but the incentive of the sort of the very next step. Because you need to find ways that you don't have to convince everyone to buy in to that wonderful objective. Because if you do, then you're almost certain not to get people to believe that you'll ever achieve it. So in summary, structures of participation for me are first this idea of not just trying to do everything, but actually putting constraints in that help actually fire people's imagination. Granularity in the sense of finding many different ways that people can participate, many different sort of resolutions of participation, if you like. Finding ways that people actually see themselves outside of themselves, see themselves reflected in a wider construct. Immediacy in the sense of actually seeing stuff happening right now, not having to wait. The more people have to wait to see the effects of the participation, the less likely you are to get the participation. Evidence, in other words, having stuff already happening somehow to convince people to be part of something. Imagination, in the sense that they're actually able to link together maybe even some of their own fantasies that they've thought might be possible to what you're doing right now, and hopefully that sort of imagination continues. The dilemma, which is always going to be in every sort of participative system, which is that there are some people who just don't want to participate. And finally, incentives, building these things in such a way that even if people decide not to participate, that the project doesn't fail, that there's always something that can be achieved, even with a minimum participation. Thanks very much.